The church bells echoed through the quiet Sunday morning, their chimes carrying through the crisp air. Families strolled in, their footsteps light against the stone pavement, whispers of greetings and warm embraces filling the sacred space. Among them, a woman in a modest blue dress led two teenagers inside. They walked with quiet reverence, their pale skin and almost white hair catching the golden sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows. As they settled onto a wooden pew near the back, the twin Noah and Eli exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. It had been years since they last stepped foot in a church, and something about this place unsettled them. Maybe it was the whispers of the past, the memories they had buried deep. Noah adjusted his sleeves, his fingers twitching against the fabric. He had always been the quieter of the two, the one who overthought things. Eli, on the other hand, carried himself with an easy confidence, though even he seemed tense today. The priest stepped forward, his voice steady as he welcomed the congregation. The twins barely listened. Their eyes roamed the room, scanning faces, searching. For what? They weren't sure. Then it happened. Noah stiffened first. His breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with a man standing near the altar. Eli noticed, too. A cold shiver ran down his spine as recognition struck. The man had aged, but there was no mistaking him. A wave of dizziness washed over Noah. His vision blurred at the edges. He felt Eli's hand tighten around his wrist. Neither of them spoke, but their thoughts screamed the same thing. They had seen this man before, 10 years ago, the night they were taken. Their nanny had screamed. The front door had been forced open. There had been rough hands, muffled cries, darkness, swallowing them whole. The memories came rushing back now, hitting them like a storm. The man at the altar turned slightly, and for a brief moment, his eyes met theirs. Recognition flashed across his face, and then he smiled. Noah's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He felt Eli's grip on his wrist tighten, grounding him, but the world around them suddenly felt unreal. The man at the altar, his smile, it was as if time folded in on itself, dragging them back to the night they were stolen. Eli was the first to look away, forcing himself to breathe. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Could it really be him? After all these years? He chanced another glance, expecting the man to have disappeared like a ghost, but no, he was still there, still watching them. Noah swallowed hard, his throat dry. Eli, he whispered, barely moving his lips. What do we do? Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. His thoughts were tangled between past and present, between fear and fury. He wanted to stand up, walk straight to that man, and demand answers. But his body refused to move. The priest's voice droned on, but neither of them heard a word. The scent of old wood and burning candles filled the air, but all they could focus on was the slow, deliberate way the man shifted his stance, as if waiting for them to make the first move. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked toward the side door of the church. He didn't rush. He didn't hide. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had already won. Noah felt a jolt of panic. "He's leaving," he hissed. Eli's mind snapped into focus. "We have to follow him." Noah hesitated. The idea of chasing after the man who had stolen a decade of their lives made his stomach twist. But Eli was already moving, slipping out of the pew and heading toward the door. Noah had no choice but to follow. They weaved through the congregation, careful not to draw attention. Their guardian, the woman who had brought them here, was still seated, unaware of their sudden departure. The church door creaked slightly as they pushed through it, stepping out into the crisp air. The street outside was busy with families heading home, children laughing as they ran ahead of their parents. But the man was already halfway down the block, walking at an unhurried pace, as if he had all the time in the world. Eli and Noah exchanged a look. Then, without a word, they started after him. The man turned a corner. When the twins reached it, Their breath caught. He was gone. Noah turned in a circle, scanning every doorway, every alley. "Where did he?" A hand clamped onto Eli's shoulder. Noah barely had time to react before another hand grabbed him too. A sharp pull, a quick movement, and suddenly they were being dragged backward into a narrow alleyway. Panic exploded in Noah's chest. He struggled, but the grip was strong. A deep voice whispered, "Keep walking, don't make a scene." Eli thrashed, but the stranger shoved him forward. The movement forced them deeper into the alley, away from the bustling street. Noah's breath came in short gasps. His mind screamed for him to fight, but fear had frozen his limbs. Then, just as suddenly as they had been grabbed, the hands released them. They spun around, stumbling back, their eyes wide. The man stood in front of them. Closer now, they could see the lines on his face, the graying stubble on his chin. His eyes, cold, calculating, studied them, as if seeing how much they remembered. "Look at you," he said softly. "All grown up." Noah felt sick. The voice, it was familiar. Too familiar. Eli was the first to speak. "Who are you?" His voice was sharp, edged with anger. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head slightly. "You don't remember?" Noah's stomach twisted. He did remember. Pieces of it, at least. The dark room, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. "You took us," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That night. You and someone else." The man's lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile but didn't. "And yet, here you are," he said, "living your lives, safe, healthy." Eli took a step forward, fists clenched. "Where were we?" His voice shook with barely contained rage. "Where did you take us?" The man exhaled slowly. "That's a long story." Noah's hands curled into the fabric of his sleeves. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand. But there was something about the way the man spoke, the calmness in his tone, that made his skin crawl. Eli wasn't as patient. "Tell us," he demanded. The man studied them for a long moment, before he finally said, "Not here." He glanced toward the entrance of the alley. "You've already been seen. We'll talk soon." Noah felt another wave of dread. "What does that mean?" The man didn't answer. He simply took a step back, blending into the shadows of the alley. Eli lunged forward, but by the time he reached the spot, the man was gone. The twins stood there, hearts racing, the weight of what just happened settling over them. This wasn't over. Not even close. Eli's hands were still clenched into fists as he stood frozen in the alley. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his pulse thudding in his ears. Noah stood beside him, staring at the empty space where the man had disappeared. The silence between them was heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had just happened. Noah finally exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Did that just happen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli swallowed hard, still staring into the shadows. "Yeah," he muttered. "It did." A million thoughts raced through Noah's mind, crashing into each other. The man had known them. He had spoken like he was familiar with their past, their lives like he had been watching them. And then, just like that, he had vanished. Eli turned to him, his eyes dark with frustration. "We should have stopped him." Noah shook his head. "How?" "He grabbed us before we even saw him coming. And even if we did stop him, then what? What if someone else was watching?" Eli let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "We can't just let him disappear again." Noah agreed, but the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. The man had said, "We'll talk soon." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a promise either. It was a warning. The sounds of the church congregation still filled the street behind them. Laughter, conversations, footsteps on pavement. It felt strange, how normal everything was outside this alley while their world, had just been turned upside down. Eli suddenly grabbed Noah's arm. "We need to find out who he is," he said, urgency in his voice. "If he took us, there has to be a record somewhere. News reports, old police files, something." Noah hesitated. Digging into their past meant opening doors that had been locked for a decade. It meant facing the memories they had spent years trying to forget. But what choice did they have? "Okay," Noah finally said, "but we need to be smart about this." Eli nodded, and without another word they stepped back onto the busy sidewalk, blending into the Sunday crowd like nothing had happened. That night, in the quiet of their shared room, they began their search. Eli sat hunched over his laptop, scrolling through old articles while Noah sifted through online archives. The glow of the screen illuminated their faces, casting sharp shadows across the walls. "Here," Eli muttered, eyes narrowing as he clicked on a link. An article from 10 years ago. Twin boys abducted from their home while under nanny's care. Authorities suspect organized operation. Noah leaned in, his stomach twisting as he read the words. He barely remembered that night, just flashes of fear, of darkness, of being taken. But seeing it in black and white made it feel real in a way he wasn't prepared for. Eli kept scrolling. "There's more. The investigation lasted months, but there were no leads, no suspects, nothing. Just..." He stopped. Noah looked up. "What?" Eli pointed at a section of the article. Nanny questioned but found unresponsive, suffered severe trauma. A chill ran through Noah. "What does that mean?" Eli's jaw tightened. "It means something happened to her that night. Something bad." Noah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Do you think she's still..." Eli was already typing. It took a few minutes, but then he found it. "She's alive, but she's in a care facility. She never recovered." Noah felt a lump form in his throat. "We have to talk to her." Eli nodded, determination in his eyes. "First thing tomorrow." Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Noah closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, the knowing look in his eyes, the way he had smiled, like he wasn't afraid, like this was just the beginning. The next morning, they made their way to the facility, a small, quiet place on the outskirts of the city. The building was old but well-maintained, with large windows that let in the morning light. The receptionist glanced at them curiously as they asked about the woman. "Your family?" she asked. Noah hesitated. "Something like that." The woman studied them for a moment before nodding. "She doesn't talk much, but you can see her." They followed her down a long hallway, their footsteps muffled by the soft carpet. When they reached the room, the receptionist gave them a small nod before stepping away. Inside, a woman sat by the window, her back to them. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled into a loose braid. She was staring outside, unmoving. Noah felt a sudden rush of emotions, sympathy, guilt, unease. Eli cleared his throat. "Miss?" The woman flinched at the sound, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Slowly, she turned. Noah's breath caught. Her eyes were hollow, distant, as if she wasn't fully there. Eli took a cautious step forward. "Do you remember us?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, her lips parted. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I never stopped looking." Noah felt his heart skip. "What do you mean?" She blinked slowly, her gaze shifting between them, and then she whispered something so soft they almost didn't hear it. "He said he'd come back for you." A cold shiver ran down Noah's spine. Eli's voice was tense. "Who?" The woman's eyes flickered. With something fear, maybe regret. And then, barely above a breath, she said, "He never left." Noah and Eli stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats. The room around them felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. "He never left." The words hung between them, heavy and terrifying. Noah's fingers curled into fists, his mind racing. What did she mean? Was he watching them now? Had he always been watching? Eli stepped forward, his voice low but firm. Who is he? The nanny's gaze flickered with something a flash of recognition, then fear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then she hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, to the window, as if she was afraid someone might be listening. Noah's heart pounded. Please, he urged. We need to know. The woman took a shaky breath. Then, finally, she whispered, You were never supposed to come back. A chill ran down Noah's spine. Eli clenched his jaw, frustration evident in every muscle of his body. What does that mean? Why were we taken? Who was behind it? The nanny shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the chair. I tried to stop it, she said, her voice breaking. I fought. I screamed. But they... She shut her eyes tightly, as if forcing the memories away. They took you anyway. Noah swallowed hard. Who are they? The woman's breathing turned shallow, panicked. She shook her head violently. I can't if they know I talked to you. Eli knelt in front of her, his voice softer now. No one has to know. Just tell us what you remember. The nanny looked at them both for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out something small, something she had kept hidden for years. She held it out with a shaking hand. Noah hesitated before taking it. It was a photograph. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the image was clear. Two boys identical, small, innocent, standing in front of a grand house holding hands. They couldn't have been older than 4 or 5. Noah's fingers tightened around the photo. His chest ached. He knew that house. He didn't know how, but something deep inside him recognized it. Eli leaned over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. Where is this? The nanny swallowed hard. It's where you came from. Noah frowned. What do you mean? This isn't our old home. No, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's where you belonged before you were taken. Silence. Noah's vision blurred for a second. He gripped the arm of the chair to steady himself. Before we were taken? Eli shot him a sharp glance. That's not possible. We were taken from our home when we were 7. We remember that. The nanny shook her head. You remember what they wanted you to remember. A sick feeling settled in Noah's stomach. No, that doesn't make sense. Our parents weren't your parents. Noah felt like the floor had just shifted beneath him. Eli's face darkened. What are you saying? The nanny closed her eyes for a long moment. Then, when she opened them, there was something deeply sad in them. You weren't kidnapped 10 years ago, she whispered. You were returned. The room felt like it had tilted sideways. Noah's pulse roared in his ears. Eli shook his head, his voice sharp. That's a lie. The nanny didn't argue. She just stared at them, as if waiting for them to put the pieces together. Noah forced himself to take a breath, his thoughts spinning. If that's true, then who took us the first time, and why were we brought back? The nanny hesitated. Then, for the first time, she said the name, and everything shattered. Noah's hands went numb. Eli went completely still. The name was familiar. Too familiar, because it wasn't just a stranger's name. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. The nanny's face paled. Her lips trembled. No, you're here, she whispered. Eli grabbed Noah's wrist. We have to go, now. Noah could barely move, his body locked in shock. But then he heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the door handle turning. The door handle turned slowly, the metallic creak cutting through the silence like a knife. Noah's breath hitched. His muscles tensed as he and Eli exchanged a sharp glance. Their instincts screamed at them to run, but their feet felt rooted to the floor. The nanny's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. She motioned for them, to move, to get out, but it was too late. The door swung open. A man stepped inside, Not the man from the church, someone else. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression calm, too calm. His gaze swept the room before landing on the twins. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, but his face remained unreadable. Noah's stomach churned. He didn't know this man, but something about him felt familiar. The man exhaled slowly, as if this moment had been inevitable. "It's time to go," he said. Eli took a step forward, his fists clenched. "We're not going anywhere with you." The man tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "You don't understand. You never had a choice." Noah's pulse pounded in his ears. "Who are you?" The man's gaze shifted to the nanny, who was gripping the armrest of her chair, her entire body trembling. A cold smile flickered across his lips. "You shouldn't have told them." She didn't respond, but the sheer terror in her eyes told Noah everything he needed to know. Eli moved first, fast. He grabbed Noah's wrist and yanked him toward the other side of the room. They had to get out now. The man barely reacted. He simply reached into his pocket. Noah saw the movement, his mind screaming warnings. He didn't wait to see what the man was reaching for. He shoved the window open, the cold air rushing in. "Go," Eli hissed, pushing Noah forward. Noah climbed onto the ledge, his heart hammering. The drop wasn't too high, but his limbs felt frozen. Behind him, the nanny let out a sharp gasp. Then a loud thud. Noah whipped his head around just in time to see her slumped in her chair, her body still, her face pale. Eli cursed under his breath. "Noah, jump!" The man took a slow step forward, his expression never changing. "You don't have to make this difficult," he said. Noah didn't listen. He pushed off the ledge, his body twisting as he landed on the grass below. The impact jolted. Through his legs, but he forced himself up. A second later, Eli landed beside him. Noah barely had time to catch his breath before Eli grabbed his arm and started running. The cold air stung their skin as they sprinted across the yard. Behind them, the man's footsteps were calm, unhurried. He wasn't chasing them. He didn't need to, because he knew something they didn't. Noah didn't dare look back. His lungs burned, but they didn't stop running until they reached the street. A car passed, headlights flashing, but no one paid them any attention. Eli slowed, his breath ragged. "We have to." A black car pulled up beside them. Noah's stomach dropped. The back window rolled down, and inside, sitting perfectly still, was the man from the church. He smiled. "I told you we'd talk soon." Noah's breath came in short, shallow bursts. The streetlights buzzed overhead, their dim glow barely cutting through the darkness. Eli stood tense beside him, fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. The man from the church leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Get in the car," he said, his voice smooth, almost patient. "We have unfinished business." Noah's entire body screamed no. Every instinct told him to run. But where? They had barely escaped the last time, and now, standing in the open street, with nowhere to hide, they were trapped. Eli shook his head. "We're not going anywhere with you." The man let out a small sigh, almost disappointed. "You don't even know what you're running from." Noah swallowed hard. "Then tell us. What do you want?" The man tilted his head, studying them. Then, with eerie calm, he said, "To take you home." Noah's stomach twisted. Home? The photograph flashed in his mind, the grand house, the faded colors, the truth that had been buried for years. Eli took a step forward. "That place, was it real?" The man nodded slowly. "It was. And it still is." Noah felt his pulse hammering. "Then, why were we taken away?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because they didn't want you to remember." A chill ran down Noah's spine. "Who?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the car. "If you want the truth, you'll have to come with me." Noah hesitated. This was a trap it had to be. But at the same time, he knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eli glanced at him. A silent conversation passed between them. Then, before Noah could second-guess himself, Eli opened the door and slid inside. Noah's breath caught. His brother had just made the decision for both of them. With no other choice, he followed. The car doors locked the second they were inside. The air was thick with tension. The man from the church turned slightly to face them. "You were never supposed to leave," he said. "And when you did, they made sure you forgot everything." Noah's fingers dug into the seat. "Who are they?" The man's expression darkened. "The people who raised you." Eli stiffened. "That's not possible." "Our parents." "Weren't your parents?" The man interrupted. Noah felt the same sick feeling from before, the pieces of the past twisting into something new, something horrifying. "Then who were they?" The car slowed, turning down an empty road. The streetlights faded, swallowed by the trees lining the road. The man didn't look at them as he spoke. "They were your keepers. Your real family is waiting." Noah's hands clenched into fists. Why now? Why come back after all these years? The man finally turned his head, his expression colder than before. "Because they know the truth is coming for them, and they'd rather see you gone than let you remember." The car pulled to a stop. Noah's breath hitched as he looked out the gay window. The house from the photograph stood before them, untouched by time. But what truly made his blood run cold? The front door was already open, and someone was waiting inside. Noah's heart pounded as he stared at the open door. The house stood eerily silent, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. It looked exactly like the photograph untouched, frozen in time. But the figure standing inside sent a chill through his bones. A woman. She was dressed in white, her hair long and silver, her expression calm yet unreadable. She didn't move, didn't call out to them. She simply waited. Eli shifted beside him. "Noah," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah swallowed hard. His body felt locked in place, but something inside him, something buried deep, was pulling him forward. The man from the church opened his door. "It's time." Neither twin moved at first. A lifetime of uncertainty, of fear, had led to this moment. Did they really want to know the truth? Noah took a slow, shaky breath and stepped out of the car. Eli followed. Their feet crunched against the gravel driveway as they approached the house, the cold night air wrapping around them. The woman didn't speak until they were close. Then, in a voice so soft yet filled with weight, she said, "Welcome home." Noah's chest tightened. "Who are you?" She studied him for a moment, then Eli. "I am your mother." Eli's breath hitched. "That's not possible." Her gaze didn't waver. "It is, and I can prove it." She turned, stepping into the house. The twins hesitated, before following, every nerve on edge. The inside was just as they had seen in the photograph, elegant, yet strangely cold. There were no personal touches, no warmth, just an empty space filled with secrets. She led them down a hallway lined with old portraits. As they passed, Noah's stomach twisted. The faces, they all had the same pale skin, the same piercing eyes, the same features he and Eli saw in the mirror every day. The woman stopped at the end of the hall and pushed open a heavy wooden door. Inside, a dimly lit room held a large desk, stacks of papers, and a single open box. She gestured toward it. "Everything is in there." Eli moved first, reaching inside. His fingers trembled as he pulled out a stack of documents, birth certificates, medical records, newspaper clippings. Noah leaned over, his eyes scanning the words. There it was, his name, Eli's name. But the date of birth didn't match what? "They had always believed we were born here," Noah whispered, realization dawning. The woman nodded. "Yes." Eli's jaw tightened. Then why were we taken? Why were we raised by strangers? A shadow passed over her face. Because they didn't want you to know who you really were. Noah clenched his fists. Why? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Because of what you were meant to become. Silence filled the room. Eli sat, the papers down, his fingers digging into the table. We don't understand, she exhaled softly. This family, our family, has always been different. There are those who feared what you might grow into. They thought it was better to take you, to erase your past, to give you a different life. Noah's mind spun. But why now? Why bring us back after all this time? Because they know the truth is unraveling, she said, and they are afraid. Eli shook his head. Afraid of what? She finally stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Afraid of you. The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Noah tried to process everything. The life they had lived, the memories, the struggles, it had all been carefully crafted to keep them from knowing the truth. And now, standing here, the truth was staring them in the face. Eli set his jaw. Then what happens now? The woman studied them carefully. That choice is yours. Noah exchanged a look with Eli. For the first time, they truly had control. No one was forcing them to stay or leave. No more running, no more searching. Noah took a slow breath. We need time. She nodded. Of course. Eli stepped back. We need to figure out who we are on our own terms. She didn't argue. You will always have a home here. As they turned to leave, the man from the church watched them silently from the doorway. He didn't stop them, didn't try to persuade them. Noah hesitated at the door. A part of him knew this wasn't the end of their story. There were still questions, still pieces missing. But for now, they had found the most important thing, the truth. As he and Eli stepped into the night, the road ahead felt uncertain. But for the first time, they weren't running from the past. They were walking toward their future.